It's a great privilege for me to welcome this afternoon a very distinguished clinical psychologist who very kindly has stepped into our program, I think not exactly the last moment, but relatively recently after someone else had to drop out. So we're delighted to welcome today Professor Michael Wang, who is Emeritus Professor of Clinical Psychology in the Centre for Medicine at the University of Leicester. He has a very distinguished career which is ongoing. He is a former chair of the Division of Clinical Psychology of the British Psychological Association. He's currently chair of the Association of Clinical Psychologists here in the UK, and he's also a qualified clinical neurophysiologist, neuropsychologist. Of particular interest to our topic for this afternoon is the fact that Professor Wang has worked as a clinical psychologist now for more than 40 years. And he's also a founder member of the British Association of Christians in Psychology, for which he was chair for many years, therefore of particular relevance to the whole area of science and religion as we address that this afternoon. I have to notice that he mentions in his bio, so I'm sure he won't mind me mentioning it, that he's in the north of England, and he's proud of his mixed ethnic heritage of Chinese and Yorkshire. There we go. So a special welcome to Professor Wang. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you, Hugh, for inviting me along. I've long heard of the Faraday Institute, and this is the first time I've had a chance to experience it, and I'm very impressed with what I've experienced. I wish I could have been here for the whole week with you, but when you retire, life is very hectic, I promise you.
It's true, actually.
I recommend it, nevertheless. I became a Christian at the age of 13. Yes, I don't want to repeat things that have already been said. Another thing that might be relevant is that I've been a practicing clinical neuropsychologist for about 25 years, and that involves me examining patients with traumatic brain injury or hypoxic brain injury. And I've probably seen about 300 people over the years in total with various types of brain injury, a lot of them with frontal lobe injury, which I'll talk about later in this talk. I've also had a research interest in anesthesia, and I will be talking about that too. And I think all of these things are relevant to the nature of consciousness. I do need to warn you that some of this presentation is disturbing, and if any of you are squeamish, some of the slides you will not find very pleasant, and I'll try and give you warning if you're squeamish to look away if we have any of those, or when those sorts of slides come on. Okay, so let me begin. I'm very aware as well, I should say, that I'm speaking in what is the overarching title of this section is Reductionism and Faith. And I hope you'll see that I'm actually operating from a reductionist point of view in many respects, but I hope to give you an indication of how I integrate that with my walk with the Lord and my own personal faith. So I'm going to start, this is just an overview of the talk. So I'm going to be talking in 5 sections, as that indicates. So let me begin with some starting propositions. Now, I have to say that these are kind of deliberately provocative, but they, at this point in time, I think I probably believe those things. I'm not sure I will forever, and I'm sure there are lots of people here who will disagree with them. I'm going to argue that the biblical soul is the same as consciousness, that consciousness is embodied and dependent on neurophysiological function, and that death implies complete loss of consciousness. And I'm referring to sleep. So I think it's undeniable that the biblical account of death is all about sleep. If you think about Jesus and Jairus' daughter, how they were all mocking him when he said she's just asleep, And then you think about the raising of Lazarus. You think about, I'm just in the middle of the book of Kings in the Old Testament. And almost every chapter ends with, and this particular king went to sleep with his fathers. Yeah? So sleep is right the way through the biblical account. I also believe that there is going to be a general resurrection, a universal resurrection, and that will involve re-embodiment and universal recovery of consciousness. Again, I'm aware that might be a bit contentious with some people, but that's what I'm arguing. Okay, and we can have a good discussion at the end, hopefully, about whether those things are true for you. So, there are some major implications, okay? From a worldly perspective, after death, people and souls don't exist in some ethereal parallel existence. They don't exist. They really don't. Until the general resurrection. So from a personal perspective, death is exactly like a deep sleep. One moment approaching death, the next awoken at the general resurrection. And the time between is not experienced. Yeah? I think that's the implication of the biblical account. Okay. So basically, I don't believe in car batteries being dropped into motor vehicles. There aren't souls that are put in at a particular point, maybe at conception or even at christening. I'll let you enjoy that for a moment. So in essence, I disagree with Descartes. And I think Descartes has probably been misrepresented, and I think his views were a bit more sophisticated than sometimes they're made out to be. But there's no doubt that we attribute dualism to Descartes, and I'm opposing dualism because I'm saying we're embodied beings. We are embodied, we're not in compartments. Okay, now, if you take all those propositions that I put forward, there are some immediate problems, aren't there? Dementia. What do you make of dementia? What is happening to the soul or spirit in dementia? When someone with dementia dies of dementia and they're resurrected, will they be resurrected with dementia? I'm just going to leave I have some answers, but I'll leave those with you to think about. What about even more vexing, personality change? I was mentioning frontal lobe damage. It's one of the common features is people's personalities change as a result of frontal lobe damage. These are my parents, sadly both passed on. But my father, who's the Chinese one, he 5 years before his death, he went completely mute because he had a form of Parkinson's disease. And we lost the man that we knew. He was a very charismatic, articulate, eloquent guy. And he was no longer there. This is Phineas Gage, a very famous case in neuropsychology. So he was working on the American Railroad as a tamper, which means that he was putting dynamite into a hole and then tamping it with a tamping rod. And on one occasion, the dynamite ignited and sent the tamper hole straight through his skull. So you can see there where it went through. And it actually obliterated a significant part of his frontal lobe. And this was written up in the American medical literature because, again, there was a very significant personality change as a result of that. And indeed, we know, this is a big meta-analysis that was published in 2010 of many trials, studies of prison inmates. And it turns out that around 60% of prison inmates, this is an international study, have brain damage of various kinds. So, you know, it's tempting to argue that the significant proportion of the prison population have offended, perhaps because of brain injury and its effects on behavior. So that's another conundrum to think about. If we're worried about morality and our status in the next life. Another slightly disturbing and puzzling thing is that during the 1970s, there was a whole series of patients who were operated on by surgeons, neurosurgeons, in order to treat chronic and severe epilepsy. And in some of these operations, they actually cut through what's known as the corpus callosum, which is the band of fibers between the two hemispheres of the brain. And what was found was that in some of these patients, it would be as if there were two people inhabiting the same body. That you could have instances where one arm would be trying to pull trousers down, the other arm trying to keep them up, as if the body was at war with itself, as if there were two minds in the same body. Okay, so I just want you to sort of keep those ideas in your mind, because I'm going to move on now to talk about the nature of consciousness from a neuropsychological point of view. This I love. It's actually a sculpture, but it's the foundation stone of the McGill Neurology Institute in Montreal. And it basically, you can see it's a brain, but it's got all these little people, babies even. And that really is a very clever representation of how the brain is. We have all these modules inside our brain that are doing many different functions that we are totally unaware of. And they are functioning all the time. And they are relatively independent. And one of the purposes of consciousness is if things start to go wrong with any of those modules, then consciousness needs to step in and try and sort out the problem. And I'm going back now to my undergraduate years. You can see this is a very old, in fact it was a book by Miller, Galanter and Prebram. In 1960, they started talking about the TOTE unit, test, operate, test, exit. Now this was a revolution because this is 1960. If you remember, within psychology, mainstream psychology, everything was behavioral. So psychologists have been following J.B. Watson, John Watson, who said there was nothing in the black box to concern psychologists. Very surprising thing to say. But we're only interested in what comes out, what goes in and what comes out, inputs and outputs. But Miller, Galanter and Prebram started talking about this as being a basic building block of human cognitive operations. And if you see the bit that it's basically, the example is, if you're hammering a nail, check the nail position, hit the nail with the hammer. Is the nail still sticking up? Is it still proud? No, then you stop. If it isn't, then you carry on. And that sort of monitoring loop, I would argue, is the basis of the development of consciousness. Now it may seem a very simple idea, but if we then go on to look at some of the more sophisticated cognitive models of consciousness, what we find is it's all a development of that test, operate, test, exit unit. So the whole idea of consciousness is that it is monitoring the activity of a host of subunits and is watching out for mismatch. And that's how, in theory, consciousness has evolved. There are a number of models here. I'm not going to take you through them all. We haven't got time. But this is probably the most influential present model, which is called the global workspace model. And essentially, it's the whole idea that you've got all of these subunits, these modules operating in the background, and then you've got a global workspace which is what we call consciousness. And it's a bit like someone standing on a stage with a big audience in the darkness. And I think they call these super troopers after ABBA. Well, ABBA made a song, it's super troopers, but that, you know, it's a searchlight is on the person on the stage, but occasionally the searchlight will go on to someone in the audience, and that's because there's been a problem, or so there's been a mismatch. So that the stage area is essentially what we're conscious of, or consciousness. And it's thought that all of those kinds of operations are largely, but not necessarily wholly, located in the frontal lobes of the brain. Okay. Now, there are many of my colleagues, especially secular colleagues in cognitive psychology, who would argue that consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon. It's simply the smoke out of the engine. It's of no major significance in itself. Okay. So I just want to go on record as saying I don't agree with that. I actually think the absolute reverse. I think that this, what we're talking about today, is the whole point of creation. If you're an evolutionist, it is the ultimate objective of evolution. Consciousness, the soul. Okay, so that's my perspective on this. Now, I'm going to move on to talk about anesthesia. You still with me? Yeah. Right. So, how on earth did I get? I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm interested in the mind. I'm trained to deal with mental health problems and so on. Why on earth would I get into an operating theatre? Well, it all began with the chap without the beard. You see, I did have a beard at one point. This photograph is probably at least 35 years. No, sorry, I told a lie. It's about 30 years old. But the chap on the left is Dr. Ian Russell, consultant anaesthetist, now retired. Enormous stroke of good fortune or providence, whichever way you want to interpret it. One day I was sitting minding my own business in my office. There was a knock at the door. This gentleman came in and he said to me, I've just come back from a conference on the problem of anesthetic awareness, patients becoming conscious during surgery when they shouldn't. And I discovered that all the American anaesthetists are collaborating with psychologists. Is there anybody here who might be interested? Oh gosh, I was looking a gift horse in the mouth. I was partly because I have a background in psychophysiology, which is the relationship between biological, physiological variables like heartbeat, skin conductance, physiological functions, and psychological states. And I'd noticed that anaesthetists were measuring these things in operating theatres, but for an entirely different reason, essentially just to make sure the patient's still alive. So as a psychologist, I really wanted to get into the operating theatre to see if I could measure some of these things from a psychological perspective, correlating with different states. So that's basically how I ended up in working on anaesthesia. And although this may sound terribly grandiose, I have to say that I think this man, Sigmund Freud, would have given his right arm to be able to do the experiments that I was able to do in the operating theatre on consciousness, because I think that Sigmund Freud was interested in consciousness. And you maybe know that he started out by doing experiments with hypnosis as an example of an altered state of consciousness. So I like to think that what I've got out of the work with anaesthetists and anaesthesia has gained some really great insights that maybe Siggy would have been interested in at least. Okay, before I go further into general anaesthesia, I need to explain what's involved in having a general anaesthetic. I know you're not substantially medical practitioners apart from Stephanie. So here we go. So there are basically three components to a general anaesthetic. The obvious one is called the hypnotic, which is intended to cause people to lose consciousness. Okay? Then added to that is an analgesic, a painkiller. Now you may be thinking, if you're unconscious, why do you need a painkiller? It's a good question, but in fact, physiologically, opioid analgesics are very helpful because they suppress the physiological shock reaction to being cut surgically. So there's a physiological, not a psychological, physiological reaction to the surgeon's knife, and that suppresses it. And here's the interesting one. There is also a muscle relaxant. Now, that sounds terribly benign. It's not benign. It's a drug that's related to curare and causes complete muscle paralysis. Okay. Such that if you're unfortunate enough to become conscious during an operation, you're likely not to be able to move. And I'll show you a bit more about that. And you may say, why on earth are they using that? Actually, it's been a revolution because it's allowed major surgery to take place when it couldn't in the past. It was very difficult to get through, especially the abdominal muscles, get through them without this type of drug. And it's very important to remember that these three components are independent, so it's perfectly possible to give too little of one and too much of another. Okay. Right. Yeah, that's the South American, Amazonian use of curare. Okay. Now, once I got involved in this area, one of my first big lessons, maybe you would say, well, it was pretty obvious, wasn't it? A bit slow on the uptake, maybe I was. But one of my first big lessons was memory is independent of consciousness. Okay. Let me give you an example. Well, this is the first clinical side, medical side. So this guy is having a colonoscopy, a form of endoscopy where a camera is pushed up the backside. And so what's going on here is he's having a conversation with the surgeon about his insides. So there is a monitor showing what they're seeing from the camera inside it. So I was there, observed this conversation. Half an hour later, I had a conversation with the patient afterwards, and I, said, "So what do you remember of the thing?" And he said, "What are you talking about? I had a general anesthetic." He had a complete blank for the period of the endoscopy. So from his point of view, because he had a blank in his memory, he assumed that he'd had a general anesthetic and had been unconscious. But he hadn't. He'd been having a conversation with a surgeon. So memory is independent of consciousness. Now, how can that be? Well, psychologists have something known as a two-process model of memory, which kind of explains what's going on. We have what's known nowadays as working memory, which is a short-term memory store, and it's believed this only lasts about 20 seconds, so it's really short. Unless we rehearse the information, a bit like when you're revising for an exam, you rehearse information, and that will artificially extend the time that it's in this short-term memory store. But unless it's actually moved through to the long-term memory store on the right, it will be lost. You won't remember it. And that process that we call encoding, the movement of information from the short-term memory store to the long-term memory store, is vulnerable. It's very vulnerable to a number of different circumstances. So drugs, alcohol, and even traumatic brain injury can damage that process of moving information from the short-term store to the long-term store. And that's exactly what's happening in the case of benzodiazepines that are used with endoscopy. And well, sometimes I get into trouble for mentioning this. It's also what's happening in date rape. Yeah? Offenders are using the amnesic effects of benzodiazepines to have that same effect. So asking a patient whether they remember anything after a general anesthetic really isn't good enough. It won't tell you who's conscious and who isn't, who has been unconscious and who hasn't. So now you may be wondering, well, how do anaesthetists detect consciousness? The biggest problem is the muscle relaxant. And that is because paralyzed patients just look as though they are unconscious and are unable to indicate their predicament. Anaesthetists are taught in their training to watch out for changes in autonomic and hemodynamic variables, such as heart rate and blood pressure and sweating and tear production during an operation. So they're watching for those things. But unfortunately, they don't provide reliable warning of wakefulness. Just to illustrate that, this is a former patient of mine who got herself into a women's magazine when she had an episode of wakefulness for about 3/4 of an hour of her hysterectomy with full pain and consciousness. And this is her anesthetic chart printout. And if I just draw your attention to the right-hand column, those are the blood pressures. And essentially, if you look down them, I think there's only just one down here of 142 over 104 that looks, so it's 155 over 130 there. But most of them show no indication, and we know that through most of that period, she was fully conscious. So basically, it's unreliable. Now, there is actually something that really is much more reliable, and we have been having some success in persuading the anesthetic community that it should be using this a lot more. And it's called the isolated forearm technique, and it's very simple. You just put a tourniquet on the forearm just before the muscle relaxant is injected. So that means that the forearm and the hand are not paralyzed. You can see this lady's got a pair of headphones on, and it's saying, "Mary, if you can hear my voice, open and close the fingers of your right." And when we first started using this technique, we found that almost half of the patients on a standard operating list actually showed evidence of consciousness at some point using this isolated forearm. And the column to look at is the one-headed response. And if you total that up, that's about 11 out of 25 patients actually showed at some point a sensible response using the forearm. I'm very pleased to tell you that particular technique, anesthetic technique, is no longer used in this country. And the modern techniques are much more reliable in keeping people unconscious. That's just to allay your fears. Okay. Also, the other point to make is that most of these people had no memory whatsoever when asked afterwards. And bearing in mind what I've said to you about the effects of drugs on the encoding phase of memory, that should be no surprise. Right. So, just to say that as a sort of starting point for looking at levels of consciousness or unconsciousness, we're already getting the beginnings of a grading system. So different types of response in this situation with the isolated forearm. Now, I want to talk about implicit memory. Now, what do I mean by implicit memory? Well, this is memory where you don't have a memory for the learning episode. Your behavior or your knowledge has changed, but you can't say why or when or how that has changed. The classic example is learning to ride a bicycle. Most of us won't remember the event of us learning to ride a bicycle, and yet we can ride a bicycle. So that's an example of implicit memory. Whereas with explicit memory, hopefully tomorrow you will remember that Mike Wang was talking about anesthesia yesterday. That's an example of explicit memory. Okay. Now, this whole area really got going because of this man. This is a South African called Bernie Levinson, and he came to London Cambridge, London. Came to London to do an anesthetic rotation, that is, train as an anaesthetist. And he was so appalled by the comments that the British surgeons were making about their patients on the table that he was convinced that that was going to have some effect on the patients. And so he did this, what now would be viewed as a very unethical experiment. What he did was he manufactured an anesthetic crisis. So, he anesthetized the patient, allowed the surgeon to begin, and then after 1 minute shouted out, "Stop the operation, the patient has turned blue." Okay. Then he'd wait a minute, and then he'd say, "Okay, I've given some oxygen, she's fine now." Okay. And he did that with 10 patients. And then 1 month later, he hypnotized those patients at a follow-up meeting and regressed them back to the operation. 4 of those 10 patients actually used those words, "Stop the operation, the patient has turned blue." And another 4 became very distressed at the appropriate point in the sequence of the operation memory. Now, there's all sorts of problems with this experiment, but you can see that it's a very dramatic demonstration, and it had a dramatic effect. And not only anaesthetists, but also psychologists became very interested in what was going on during anesthesia. And it wasn't long before people started to ask the question, well, if you can do negative things to people, can you do positive things? And so there began a whole series of positive suggestion studies. The operation's going really well, you're going to make a fabulous recovery, you're not going to be in hospital for very long, everything's going to be fine. So those sorts of suggestions were made. This was the first British study of that kind. And in this case, it was what they measured, and this was done in a double-blind fashion. No one knew who had had the positive suggestions and who hadn't. And they looked afterwards at how long these people stayed in hospital, so the discharge, and found a very significant effect. And I think there's probably at least 20 of these studies, and they're in very rigorous, robust methodology. So the fact that you get any result from this kind of study is surprising. Yeah, so there've been about 20 studies, and it's about a 2-to-1 ratio of significant versus non-significant results, although you have to remember that it's harder to publish a non-significant study. So anyway, but as I say, it's quite surprising. I just want to mention also another whole area of work done by psychologists called word priming. And this is another form of implicit memory, where the patient doesn't remember anything happening. And so what you do with word association is you might present green pear during an operation, and then after the operation you might say then, what if I say the word green to you, what comes to mind? And if they say pear, then that might suggest that there's been a priming effect. Or you might present some fruits, maybe gooseberry, during an operation, and then afterwards say, can you name the first 5 fruits that come into your mind? Now, obviously, people will say apple, pear, orange. But if they say gooseberry fairly early on in that list, then you know you've got a priming effect. Word stem completion is another one. Carton. So if you say in the operation carton, and then afterwards, how would you finish this sentence or this word if it begins with car? Most people will say pet, carpet. It's unusual for people to say carton. So if that happens, you know you've got a priming effect. And the final one, during the operation, you say dinner at 8, dinner at 8, dinner at 8, and then ask them after the operation, how do you spell the word 8? Almost everyone will say ATE, except those who've been primed. So, now, I want to just quickly move on to the issue of emotion. And again, this is our old friend Bernie Levinson. By the way, he became a psychiatrist. He didn't finish his anesthetic training. So I remember being at a conference where Bernie was the keynote speaker, and he began his talk by saying, I want you to imagine that you're on one of these rope bridges in Africa, and it's falling apart. The sticks and the rope are all falling down into some great crevasse. Bottom of the crevasse, there are crocodiles, and you're clinging on for dear life. And then a cloud comes along, and it just says, green pear, sharp lemon. point he was making was that these implicit memory studies have got no connection with the patient's predicament. However, in Germany, Dirk Schwender, an anaesthetist, and his group decided to do something to take account of this. And what they did was they took the Robinson Crusoe story and they presented a synopsis of the Robinson Crusoe story during surgery. And they specifically chose that because they thought there was a parallel between Robinson Crusoe and a patient who was in the predicament of being conscious during surgery, you know, isolated, in danger, not very anxious, not knowing what the outcome was going to be. And so what they did was they had they presented this synopsis during the surgery, and then after the surgery, they said to the patients, "What comes into your mind if I say the word Friday?" Friday. And some of the patients said, "Oh, it's the weekend. Great, I can have a good time. I don't have to go to work. Great, I love Friday." Some others started talking about desert islands. Remember, they had no idea why they were talking about desert islands. And they'd also been using a particular type of EEG. This is evoked potentials. The patients that said, "Well, it's the weekend," they were on the right-hand side. And basically what you see is the mid-latency auditory potential, which is between 40 and 80 milliseconds after the stimulus. They're flat, aren't they? And that's because they were truly unconscious. But those patients who started talking about desert islands had preserved mid-latency auditory potential. So they were probably conscious, even though they had no memory. Now, this sounds all very terribly academic, and you may not be very worried by it, but then you go and look at the literature and you discover that there's a whole series of case studies reported where patients have no memory of the operation, so they consider that it was a success and had no problem, but then subsequently develop psychological difficulties, very similar to patients who'd had traumatizing experiences of awareness with memory during the operation. So that leaves us worrying that it's not good enough to think that, okay, they've not had any memory of this traumatic event. Whatever you think of the ethics, I have to say I think it's dubious to imagine that amnesia is good enough. But even if you leave that aside, we now also have evidence of psychological disturbance, and emotional disturbance, even though there isn't explicit recall. Adrian Owen did an amazing experiment in 2006 where what they did was they got comatose patients to imagine that they were playing tennis. And at the same time, they were using functional MRI. And what they showed was that a particular part of the motor cortex of the brain lit up in the fMRI. And it got even more sophisticated than that. And so they started to be able to use it as a yes-no, a bit like my isolated forearm idea, a yes-no signaling system. So if you want to say yes, imagine you're playing tennis. And we can see it on the fMRI. So what the conclusion to that, and the answer to Wesley's question, is basically that the definition of a persistent vegetative state, or coma, is very grey. It's not properly defined. Okay. So it's perfectly possible that someone's communing with the Lord, and I'll tell you more about that. I'm nearly there. So near-death experience. I want to go on and tell you a bit about me now. Apologise that this is a bit narcissistic, but I think you'll see the relevance. Okay, so in 2013, I found myself the subject of an article in the British Medical Journal. What really annoyed me was that I wasn't a co-author. So essentially, let me tell you the background to this. I needed to have an ablation because I was suffering from atrial fibrillation, AF. And an ablation procedure is where they push cannula up through your groin, through the vasculature or into the heart. And then they deliberately burn, and I'll just show you this. They push the cannula in and through the septum, and then they burn through the parts of the myocardium, and they're deliberately creating scar tissue because scar tissue doesn't transmit, doesn't allow the conduction of the electrical impulses. So it's in order to correct aberrant electrical impulses. Unfortunately, my cardiologist managed to burn a hole in the back of my heart by accident. And 4.5 weeks after I'd had this procedure, I became very, very ill. And these were some of my symptoms: delirious, disinhibited, and I don't know if anybody knows the actual title of this painting by Salvador Dali. Very good. And that was one of the things that have come out of this. I'd always assumed that if a patient was off the wall, they wouldn't remember it afterwards. Not true. I have a great deal of memory for this period when I was seriously ill. And this is an MRI of my brain. Unfortunately, I actually developed cerebral abscess, and those dark dots, and that's one right in the middle of my right frontal lobe, is an abscess, and it shouldn't be there. Thankfully, it was fully encapsulated, and so I've not got any permanent effect. I hope that you will recognize. But during the acute phase, there's another one, you can see some more. Those black dots shouldn't be there. And you can probably see that I'm not looking completely normal. I have to say that's a bad photograph. I deliberately picked a bad photograph. This is Christmas Day 2012. So essentially, this is a paper that shows that most people who develop this complication die. So I thank the Lord. I'm very grateful to still be with you, because I shouldn't really be here. And warning now, blood and gore. So turn away or look down if you don't like blood and gore. Okay, here we go. So there are not many people who have a selfie of themselves with their chests open. So this is basically, this is my chest, my heart. My head's at the top, my legs are at the bottom, and those pipes are bypass surgery. And this yellow stuff here is normal. This yellow stuff here isn't. That shouldn't be there. That's pus. Now to scrape that out and then sew up the back of my heart. So that's basically what happened. Went to ITU and had a full-blown ICU psychosis. So, and I do remember this completely. I believed I was on a hospital ship. I thought the medics were all making packs of money during the Christmas period for operating on a hospital ship. Thought I was on the River Trent going past bank. I could see trees. The trees were real outside the ICU, but I could see them moving. So I was convinced I was, and I was busy trying to pull out my lines, which is a very common thing that people do in this situation. And at one point, you can't really see that because of the sunshine, but basically at one point I thought I'd been taken into underground underneath the ICU, and that I was in a Chinese mausoleum with great big ginger jars full of human remains. Now, I know this sounds horrific. However, I was just curious. I just wondered what is going on here. And the other thing was the two nurses who were assigned to stop me pulling my lines out were shouting at me, "Michael, stop pulling out your lines," even in this delusional mausoleum. But probably the most important thing of all for me to tell you is that I had the most amazing experience of God. And I would say that it's distinguishable from the other delusional and hallucinatory experiences I have. And although I've tried to represent what it was like with this pillar of fire, it's very difficult for me to explain because it wasn't something that I saw with my own ordinary senses. I didn't see it, I didn't hear it, I didn't feel, well, I felt it, but I didn't taste it. It wasn't with my normal six senses. I just knew he was present. And more than that, this is the creator universe standing by my bed. And more than that, I just had an overwhelming sense of his love for me. And that was just the most incredible experience. That's basically summarizing what I've just said. There's quite a literature on near-death experiences, and these are the kinds of things that people report. Now, you may be saying, well, you just started this talk by saying that you don't think there's a soul that exists outside the body, and yet here we are talking about near-death experiences. I didn't have an out-of-body experience myself. This is a very recent study by Parnia et al., 2014, which looked at patients who were being resuscitated on a cardiac unit. Big study, over 2,000, 140 patients actually looked at. But the fact is that there was only one who had a verifiable period of conscious awareness during which time cerebral function was not expected. And the whole range of experiences, not entirely dissimilar. So, that's just a concluding slide. But I wanted to just leave you with a slide that I'm not going to have time to explain, but it will give you a taste of where I'm going. And that is this one. And it's essentially a model of the progressive diminution of consciousness that is relevant to anesthesia. So that hopefully right now we're all at 9, and then if you start to give someone an anesthetic in a gradual process, they drop through these levels. So that model, it's a linear model, but it's based on my experiences in the operating theatre. Thank you very much.
Next year is going to be an opt-out system for organ donation in this country. And I'm wondering if your research will have any implications or potentially implications for the changes that they are making in determining when somebody is actually dead.
Yeah, right. Sorry. The determination of brain death is very much a neurological issue, and is at present time usually done using EEG, so looking for evidence of brain function, particularly in the cerebral cortex. Many people are left with brain stem functions that keep the body going, but not if you've basically got nothing going on in the rest of your brain, which is sadly a state that can occur, then they usually take the decision to unplug the machine. There are some very rare examples of patients who recover in the mortuary because it isn't perfect. Nothing is perfect. But I suspect that the probability of someone with a flat cerebral EEG who is then going to go on to show signs of life in the mortuary are very, very small, extremely small. Stephanie, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
If I understand well, whether we can equate death with the absence of brain function. Well, this is the often accepted definition, but in some regulations, it means that you need to measure it at 2 different time points.
Yeah.
and this has importance because if a person is brain dead, the question of transplantation of
Yeah.
his or her organs, if they become available for transplantation, yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was in hospital in December, and a young lady of about 20 was brought into the ward beside me, and she turned over and she said, "Barbara, I felt and I heard everything during that operation." She was really distressed. So I called the nurse and the doctor, the surgeon, and the anaesthetist came to have a talk with her, which I think was very important. In fact, she didn't realize how important it was. The other thing is that I think midwives are trained to be very positive in bringing their help in pain to their patients.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just to say that they use. I mean, hopefully this. I'm not saying this never happens now, but it's less common. But that used to be very common for nursing staff to tell patients like that to shut up because you'll upset the other patients. So that's thankfully something that is on the decline, and there's much more openness that this can happen.
I wonder why you think consciousness is what it is all about. I'm sure you're aware of arguments put forward by people like Yegwan Kwik Kim on overdetermination, that there is enough there on the neural level to explain our actions, and so consciousness is an epiphenomenon, which is what you started with. There's also a counter-argument possible from implicit memory, which is that a lot of our predictive processing is based on memory, and a lot of that is based on non-conscious memory. So if we can account for a huge part of our cognition without resorting to consciousnm, why is consciousness necessary for what it is all about?
Well, my answer to that is that, as Stephanie was saying, it's our lived experience is consciousness. We live at a conscious level, and that is the heart of our experience. It seems to me that the Bible is not about unconsciousness. The Bible is very much about consciousness and interactions between beings who are conscious. So I find the notion that we don't need to think about consciousness as odd as J.B. Watson's idea of a black box, and we just think about inputs and outputs. It doesn't turn me on. What I'm trying to do is to say that if you take my view that the whole thing relates to embodiment and not disembodiment, I would argue, and again I'm deliberately provocative, hopefully not offensive, I would say that some of the Christian narrative has been contaminated by pagan and Gnostic influences that results in us talking about heaven and people being in heaven right now and that sort of thing. I think that when you talk about embodiment of consciousness and of brain function, it actually becomes much more consistent with the biblical trying to argue. But having said all of that, as I started out by saying, we then have some other difficulties, which is, as I said, what do we do about brain injury? What do we think about dementia? Is it the case that when we're resurrected, all of these things are taken back to pre-accident or pre-dementia condition?
So, let me just follow you up on that one. Okay. So when a Christian, let's say in your framework, dies, they don't go to heaven. Where do they go? What happens?
They don't go anywhere.
Let it go, right? And so
They
what is
cease
this?
to exist. Actually, from our standpoint, they cease to exist. However, at the general resurrection, they're back with us, but from their perspective, no time has happened. It's just like you've just been asleep, and almost for a second. I remember many years ago, I had my very first general anaesthetic at a dentist, and 1 minute I was sitting in a dental chair, and the next minute they'd all cleared off, and there was a cup of tea on the thing, and I'd assumed that, you know, no time at all had elapsed. In fact, 20 minutes had elapsed. So that's what I presume that it's going to be like.
Right. Can I just express, I mean, simply,
Yeah.
this is all a lot of discussion, isn't it? So I'll just express the John Porton will answer that.
Okay, right.
Given that he's unable to be with us today, he's still around, he's still being fine, but very much limited to home now. I remember that same discussion coming up.
Right.
He said, well, I believe that when you die as a Christian, you're taken up into the mind of God. You know,
Yeah.
you're incorporated into God's mind, you're in a state of bliss, and you're waiting for a resurrection body. Now, I've often thought your view and his view in that sense come to the same thing.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
basically,
sure.
either way.
Yeah.
So you either got the very rapid fast forward,
Yeah.
what I call yours,
Yeah.
the very rapid fast forward, which
Yeah.
I quite like actually.
Yeah.
Or you got, you know, this other sort of model, but it comes to sort of the same thing anyway. And that's what I like about, to be comforting to anyone here who's worried about that. Question at the back, right, we're going around this way now. Yes, gentlemen. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, we're moving on this way.
Really enjoyed your talk. In fact, I was going to ask you something linked to what you just said. A quick quote, which is that I have a friend who knew someone once who, you know, really was convinced he got into his resurrection body. And he said, what I'd say about that, which is all I can say is I'd be very disappointed if that was the case. Very disappointed. But that's a quick quote. But just to say, I mean, I think this truth is really, surely, I would ask you that we don't really know what happens when we die. I have faith, and I believe I'm going to be, and I'm going to believe I'm resurrected. But Jesus said to the thief, today you will be with me in paradise.
Yeah, from the thief's point of view.
Yes.
From the thief's point of view.
True, maybe.
Okay, so we're moving around the slide, and we come up to up here, and we'll go around again. Okay. Systematic.
Thank you for your talk. I just wondered if you could comment on your perspective on two biblical passages. So the first would be Saul with the witch of Endor.
You'll have to remind me.
So if I can remember it properly, he goes to a witch and talks to Samuel, who's dead, or whether it's Samuel or not, something that is representing Samuel.
I remember. Yeah.
And the second would be, I can't remember the exact verse, but it says we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses.
Yeah.
I just would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, they're good points to make. I mean, as far as Saul's concerned, it reminds me of all those people who believe that they've had conversations with the dead. And I think the biblical position is we're not supposed to be doing that, and that those may well be spirits, evil spirits that are imitating people who have actually died. So yeah, I'm not saying that is definitely the case. I'm saying that I think that is one theological explanation for that. With regard to there being a great cloud of witnesses, you see, I believe that as far as God is concerned, he is completely outside time. We are completely time-bound, but God is completely outside time. And yet, even that cloud of witnesses could be outside of time. But in a sense, that they've been resurrected, and they've come back, if you like, to observe what's gone on through this sort of panoply of time. It may be a weak argument.
Just introducing some complicating factors, perhaps. Your linear model of consciousness demonstrates that we're not talking about an either-or thing.
No.
And perhaps this is an advanced version of the Glasgow Coma Scale in terms of degrees of
Yeah,
consciousness
yeah,
that's detectable. But there's also consciousness or meta-consciousness. So there's consciousness of what you're conscious of. And in terms of the question that the lady was asking earlier on and learning, you'll know yourself that learning without awareness is actually a stronger form of learning than learning consciously. Do you remember the EMG experiment? I don't know whether you'd care to say something about that.
Yeah, it's, Robin's just referring to my rather dodgy past when I was a trainee and got involved with an experiment, biofeedback. People remember biofeedback? And I did an experiment within an experiment, which was working out, because basically biofeedback is a form of operant conditioning. And I had a theory at that point that operant conditioning would operate better without consciousness being involved. And so I deliberately avoided my conscious mind being involved in the biofeedback. And the result was that I was the star performer. Unfortunately, I was heating, and I was decreasing, I was cooling my hand, which isn't good for the emotional state. So, yeah, and I agree with you that there are examples of where learning without awareness is much more effective and efficient, which goes back to the models of consciousness and what consciousness is trying to do. But that, for me, doesn't undermine my view that consciousness is not an epiphenomenon. It is the whole object of creation. And, you know, if you go down this list, by the way, what you said about metacognition is up at 9. It might even be 10. It's up there in terms of self-awareness. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for your talk. I have two questions, and the first one is, could you say a little bit more about why you disagree with Descartes' immaterial self, his model? And the second one was to do with when you talked about the MRI scan that was used as a stimulus to show a response from the patient if they were in that sort of state, and whether you know, similar to the arm signals that were showing that they were still conscious. This time last year, when Stephanie gave her talk on the brain, I had a sister that had a bleed on the brain, and they had operated and said, "Oh, we can't do anything more for her." They could only suggest to turn off the life support machines because there was nothing more they could do. So they've done that, and so this time last year she was still in that sort of state where they've switched it off almost a year later. So another year has passed now, and she's still in that state. So I'm just wondering whether that facility is still available to say whether or not she could communicate with me, because she's just lying there and I don't know, kind of thing.
Yeah, I suspect that you'd need to be in touch with the Cambridge group, because it's very much a research procedure. It's not a routine clinical procedure. But there's no harm in discussing that particular study with the clinicians who are looking after your sister, to ask if it could be done as a procedure. Yeah, I can't predict how they'll respond, but yeah. With regard to Descartes, I suppose my position is that I'm yet to come across, really convincing evidence of the existence of thought and consciousness outside of the function of the brain. That's essentially my position. And as I say, if you start with that assumption, it is not contrary to the biblical theology.
Well, I have another experience where I have another sister who, she had a similar thing. She had a brain hemorrhage, but she died sort of straight away. But in the weeks before she died, she was a midwife, and it became apparent that she became obsessed with these faces and things that she could see in the clouds. And she kept saying, I can see animals, I can see people in the sky, the clouds, I can see faces in the trees. And we thought something's going on. She's not right. She's saying all of these things. Maybe something's wrong with her. And even she was doing it in her workplace. So, but the day before she died, she said to my dad that she could see angels all around her.
Yeah.
And then she died the next day. So, well, we're sort of believing that there must be some other sort of spiritual realm that is apparent.
Yeah, I'm not saying that spiritual realms don't exist outside of human consciousness. I'm just arguing that as far as the human soul is concerned, we are embodied beings. And when Revelation talks about the creation of a new heaven and a new earth, I think it's referring to embodied human beings. It's not referring to ethereal spirits that are floating around in the ether. So that's what I'm referring to. But that doesn't mean that there aren't angels. I believe there are angels. Doesn't mean that there isn't a spiritual world, because of course Paul talks about principalities and powers. I completely go along with that. All I'm saying is that as far as we're concerned, as embodied human beings, it's our physiology that generates consciousness.
Thank you, Professor. I mean, from general of your slides, it feels like you are mainly focused on the phenomenon of the consciousness. So do you think we should go into the mechanism of the consciousness? Shall we think about it or do some research about it? Or like you said, maybe it can be our consciousness is outside our body, or it's from neuron, or I'm a physics student, I would like to use the quantum physics to think about it. Or in another hand, is that if we enter this field, it will be quite dangerous for us, like because, for example, for the near-death experiences, there is some scientific explanation feels like, oh, it's just an illusion, or, I mean, I'm not sure if this direction is valid.
So it sounds as though you're concerned that studying consciousness might become a threat to your faith. Is that a fair summary? Yeah, I don't see it that way. It reminds me of the fact that many psychology students, or people who, sixth formers who just about to go to university to study psychology, can be told not to do it by their pastors or ministers because they're afraid that they will lose their faith. In my experience, the people who really run risks of losing their faith are theology students more so than psychology students. But I really don't think I think it's the wrong way of looking at things to be fearful. And I would encourage you to be courageous and to look for truth. And that means when I say as important that is, the God's creation is revelation. And that also involves examining and investigating from a scientific point of view, and that's surely what today is all about.